which is a statement by Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell on reporting to Parliament on the coronavirus legislation. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question of Mr Russell to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Michael Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, since I made a statement in this chamber on our first report on the coronavirus legislation on the 9th of June, Scotland has progressed to and remains in Phase 3 of the route map. Major progress has been made in tackling coronavirus, but as last week's events clearly underlined, we are still required to show caution. The measures in the UK Coronavirus Act and the two Scottish Acts remain necessary because of the continuing severe public health and economic challenges posed by the pandemic, despite the significant progress that Scotland has made. Today, I have laid before Parliament the second report on the operation and continued necessity of the powers in both Scottish Acts and the UK Act, which covers the reporting period which ended on the 31st of July. Building on the first report published on the 9th of June, this includes provisions from the second Scottish Act, as well as information on SSIs, where their main purpose relates to coronavirus and where they are not made under the UK or Scottish Acts. This follows the amendment during the second bill process, originally proposed by Adam Tompkins and reflecting the views of the DPLR committee. As a result of that amendment, we now report on a total of 32 SSIs. In preparing the second report, we have also fulfilled the requirement to take account of available information about, and I quote from the Act, the nature and the number of incidents of domestic abuse occurring during the reporting period. This reflects an important amendment brought forward by Pauline McNeill to help inform the approach taken to domestic abuse during the outbreak, also as part of the second Scottish Bill. Overall, this second report forms a crucial part of our coronavirus strategy, demonstrating that accountability is integral to our efforts to suppress the virus. Today's report shows, I believe, that the powers available to ministers have been used proportionately, and crucially, they have not been used unless it has been judged necessary to do so. That means that whilst in some cases powers have not been commenced, as there's been no need to do so, in others we have commenced powers but have not proceeded to use them. That should not be a surprise. The legislation was intended to be enabling, so that we could respond to the virus across all its many and varied impacts with speed, determination, with all necessary tools to hand. In preparing this report, we have again sought to maintain a proportionate approach and have avoided placing undue pressure on those who are priorities properly to preserve lives. We have also, as we did in our first report, provided detail over and above the reporting requirements set out in the Scottish Acts on the operation of the powers where we think that would be helpful. Presiding Officer, since our first report was published, we've continued to develop and refine our data collection and monitoring process. For example, we've issued further surveys to establish the extent of the operation of the powers at a local level for the powers under the UK Act relating to local authority needs assessments. In the report, we have also included information on rights and equality impacts. This is key to ensuring that human rights are respected, protected and fulfilled, and equality objectives are achieved. We've also sought to include information, where possible, on how the impact of the legislation on those with protected characteristics has been taken into account. We will continue to work to consider carefully recommendations and best practice coming from the work that is being undertaken by the Parliament, stakeholders and others to ensure that human rights, children's rights and equality are protected at this time. I hope this report also indicates clearly the positive benefits of some of the key elements in the emergency legislation. For example, there is information on provisions which have allowed for the effective use of technology to deliver essential public services, such as those relating to courts and tribunals, and the conduct of business by electronic means, which have enabled 3 criminal summary trials to be held virtually in the reporting period. The use of electronic signatures and digital transmission of documents, which have enabled swift process changes which are necessary to operate court services efficiently. Similar benefits relating to the use of technology have also been demonstrable in the use of the powers for licensing and land registration. The powers relating to suspension of pension scheme rules and the establishment of the temporary social work register have provided additional resilience and enhanced capacity in the workforce. The second Scottish Act also introduced provisions relating to the carers allowance supplement. At the end of June, payment was made successfully to approximately 83,000 unpaid carers. We are now 2/3 of the way through the lifespan of the Scottish Acts, and there is considerable interest from stakeholders regarding the possible extension of the Scottish Acts beyond their current expiry point on the 30th of September. We're giving very careful consideration to the details of such an extension. We're mindful of the calls from stakeholders that provisions of the legislation in areas, for example, such as housing, have provided vital protections for individuals throughout the pandemic and that there is a continuing need for them. But we're equally mindful of the commitments we've made and which I have regularly reiterated that such legislation must not be in place for a moment longer than is necessary. On the overall question, I can now confirm that before the end of this month we will lay regulations which will, with Parliament's agreement, seek to extend the Scottish Acts from the 30th of September 2020 to the 31st of March 2021. However, we will also lay at the same time regulations which will expire certain provisions within the legislation which we deem are no longer needed. That will mean that some provisions now in place will not be extended. Work continues in order to arrive at a final position on these matters, and I will return to the Parliament in due course with recommendations. The timing of laying these regulations is intended to ensure that Parliament has time to scrutinise them, but also that they are drafted sufficiently close to the point at which the Acts expire to enable us to reflect the latest position as regards provisions which need to be covered by a proposed extension and those which can now be proposed for expiry. Presiding Officer, let me now turn briefly to the position regarding powers in the UK Act, to which the Scottish Parliament gave its consent on the 24th of March this year, I think exactly 20 weeks ago. The UK Act has a sunset clause by which it expires on the 25th of March 2022, 2 years after it was passed, subject to certain exceptions which are set out in the legislation. Under the requirements of the Act, the House of Commons will undertake a review of its non-devolved provisions after 6 months of operation, which will be at the end of September, and debate a motion on whether those provisions continue to be necessary, in precise terms that the provisions should not yet expire. The devolved provisions in the UK Act will not be in scope of that House of Commons 6 months review. However, a review of their status, operation and continuing necessity is part of the Scottish Government's own reporting on the UK and Scottish Acts. Our third report to Parliament on these powers will be due following the end of the reporting period on the 30th of September. And as part of this, we will be giving full consideration, as in our previous reports, of whether these powers continue to be necessary and proportionate. There will then be the opportunity for this Parliament to scrutinise the judgments we've made when it considers our third report and to express its view. Presiding Officer, let me conclude by noting formally, as is required by Section 15 of the First Scottish Act and Section 12 of the Second Scottish Act, that Scottish ministers have conducted a review of the provisions in Part 1 of those Acts and have prepared this report. We're satisfied that the status of the provisions set out in Part 1 of the Act remains appropriate. We've also undertaken a review of the SSIs to which Section 14 of the Second Scottish Act applies. Scottish ministers are also satisfied that the status of those SSIs at the end of the reporting period is appropriate. A review has also been conducted of the provisions of the UK Act, for which the Scottish Parliament gave legislative consent, and these are also covered within the report, and we remain satisfied that the status of these provisions remains appropriate. I now look forward to and welcome the opportunity of engagement with the Parliament as it considers the second report. Presiding Officer, though we have made considerable progress through the phases of emerging from lockdown, the crisis we are going through is not as yet ended. Indeed, the events of the past week and necessary reintroduction of lockdown measures in Aberdeen remind us of all of the very real risks of a potential resurgence of the virus. It is essential that we as a Parliament provide the legislative tools and measures to respond to the serious threat we continue to face. We only need to look around Europe and beyond to see that governments and parliaments elsewhere are still grappling with these challenges, as we are. Our job isn't yet done, and I commend this report on the Coronavirus Acts to the Chamber.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. The first from Murdo Fraser, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Alec Rowley. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. When the emergency coronavirus measures were introduced, it was understood these would be temporary and would only last as long as was necessary. Today, the Cabinet Secretary has told us the Scottish Government intends to extend these by 6 months from the end of September. Given the ongoing threat of COVID-19, That will not come as a surprise and is a measure we would support. But I hope the Scottish Government will go as far as it can in removing restrictions which are no longer necessary. And I look forward to hearing more from the Scottish Government about this in coming days. The ongoing serious nature of the COVID-19 pandemic also highlights the need for individual responsibility when it comes to compliance with regulations. And in that respect, I have two questions for the Cabinet Secretary. Firstly, is he able to give us an update as to how many penalty notices have been issued by the police for breach of the coronavirus regulations? And secondly, I have been advised by constituents that in many cases the police are not issuing penalty notices despite there being flagrant breaches of the regulations by individuals. Has the Scottish Government had any discussions with Police Scotland about the circumstances in which penalty notices will be issued, as opposed simply warnings being given to the individuals involved?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Murdo Fraser for his question and for his indication of support for the renewal of the necessary provisions within the Act. And I think that word is very important, and I'm glad that he also agrees with that. This is not, and I've made that clear, a blanket proposal for renewal. There will need to be a very serious consideration of items that may not be renewed, as well as items that are renewed. And I look forward to that discussion with his committee, because I think his committee is likely to be one that will take some of these issues forward. In terms of the operation of the Act and the role of the police, Police Scotland has been confident and has said publicly that to date compliance with the regulations has generally been good. Enforcement is for Police Scotland, and I think we'd agree with that, a last resort, where engagement, explanation and encouragement, and those 4 E's are very important, those things have failed, and they lead to the final E, which is enforcement. And the Chief Constable has made it clear, and has made it clear from the outset, it's important that the tone and style of policing reflects the need for positive engagement. Now, in terms of the statistics, between the 27th of March and the 21st of July, Police Scotland made 61,593 interventions, the majority of which, that's 94% of which, were dispersals when either informed or instructed. In other words, people were warned as to their behaviour and took that warning. Of the remaining 6%, 3,310 fixed penalty notices were issued, 349 were dispersed using reasonable force, and 268 arrests were made. Now, the number of interventions has gradually fallen. The peak was in the week ending the 10th of May at 9,778, and it dropped in the week ending 19th July, the last week in this reporting period, which we have full statistics, to 42. I would entirely agree with Murdo Fraser that enforcement is essential if there is no other means of going forward. But we've seen proportionate policing, we've seen effective policing, and we've seen the numbers come down, both as the regulations change, but also people have wished to meet what is required. And that is the bedrock of making sure that we stay safe.
Thank you. Alec Rowley to be followed by Andy Weyman.
Made comment that progress has been made in terms of tackling and driving down the virus, but I do worry that there are those who've taken their eye off the ball, and that is visible as you see people, for example, going into shops without using the mask. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to, and Labour will continue to support the government where we need powers. I also welcome the extension that is proposed to the Coronavirus Act, and specifically housing. Shelter Scotland, Citizens Advice Scotland have put forward a very strong case that Labour supports for extending the legislation to ensure that we do prevent evictions until April next year. But would he agree that, given that council housing allocations have been frozen in most parts of the country since the COVID crisis came in, that the housing crisis that Shelter Scotland talked about before COVID is continuing to become even greater, and more people are finding it difficult to access housing. At the same time, Presiding Officer, the need to drive the economy should be driven by investment in infrastructure, and that housing should be a national infrastructure priority so that we can get the houses that we need, the jobs, the skills, the training. would he seek for the government to come forward when they look at the extension of this legislation to have a wider debate on how we need to tackle the housing crisis in Scotland and grow our economy at the same time?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm quite sure that the Housing Minister, Kevin Stewart, will want to bring to this chamber debate and discussion a whole range of issues, and I'm sure he will note that that is a request that is brought here, and I'm sure he'll be sympathetic to the request to discuss all issues of housing. I have to say, in terms of this Act, the narrow responsibility that I'm bringing to this chamber for this Act, we are very mindful of some of the arguments that I think Alec Rowley is putting. The issues are not as clear-cut as they might be. There is undoubtedly a need to continue to protect tenants, and we recognise that. And yesterday, we laid regulations for a new requirement that tribunals have to consider whether a landlord has undertaken certain actions to support tenants before eviction. So we're taking actions out with and in top of the bill. But also I recognise from representations from the Housing Association in my own area, issues about allocation, which have not been able to be addressed because of the lockdown and because of issues in terms of how housing associations, for example, operate. So there are some complicated issues in here. But I know that Kevin Stewart will want to bring forward proposals as part of the renewal that meet need, that meet demand, but they're not the only issues that are relevant to housing at the moment, and I'm sure that he will take account of that from Alec Rowley.
Andy Whiteman, to be followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance out the statement. On the 18th of June, the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service responded to a written question from me, noting that 158 applications for eviction were made between 25th of March and 16th of June, and there are 484 applications outstanding, the vast majority of these initiated before the emergency period. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that, first of all, the rented provisions in the Act will be extended? Second, in particular, will the Government agree to extend the existing 6-month notice period to 12 months to ensure there are no winter evictions? Third, will the Government reconsider the need to outlaw forever evictions on the grounds of arrears accrued due to coronavirus? And fourthly, why in paragraph 7.1.1.11 in the report, under the Equality Impact Assessment, is there only mention of the landlord's property rights under Article 1, Protocol 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and no mention at all of the balancing Article 8 right in respect for a person's private and family life, his home and his correspondence?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I make it clear that the Housing Minister will come to committee, and I'm sure come to this chamber, with his detailed proposals? We cannot, in the renewal of the legislation, change the detail of the legislation. That requires new legislation. What we can do is either continue the powers or not continue the powers. And we have to decide that before we put the regulations to this chamber. And it's a clear process, and therefore we're not going to be able to amend it. So if there is a continuation of the 6 months, and I think the Housing Minister has made it clear that he would like to see that. I don't want to commit absolutely at this present moment because discussion continues, but if there is that continuation, and certainly I hope there will be, if that's continuation, the terms of it cannot be changed within this legislation. It would require new legislation to do so, and we're not planning new legislation at the present moment. In the wider question of evictions, nobody wishes to see evictions take place, and certainly there should be, and I repeat this unequivocally, there should be no evictions due to coronavirus. There are, of course, other circumstances in which evictions take place, and all of us as members of this Parliament will have seen circumstances in which that was not only an inevitability but a necessity, sometimes in terms of antisocial behaviour. So in all those circumstances, we will want to protect tenants, protect their rights, and make sure that they enjoy the security that they have. But I would ask members to remember, we cannot pick and choose to change the legislation. We can decide what we don't renew and what we do renew, and that is the question. Those are the questions that will be before us.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Can I ask once again about Schedule 9, those changes to mental health regulations, which can increase the amount of time somebody is detained for and reduce the number of clinicians required for intervention? These powers remain available to the Scottish Government, but no circumstances have yet emerged during the crisis requiring their use. When I asked the Cabinet Secretary to repeal Schedule 9 during his last report, he quoted to me the view of a senior psychologist psychiatrist in support of its retention. But, presiding officer, psychiatrists may be experts in mental health, but they are not experts in human rights, and many human rights champions are calling for its repeal. Will he now reconsider?
Cabinet Secretary.
Of course, I'm happy to say to Alec Cole-Hamilton that everything within the legislation will be considered, whether it should be renewed or not. But I think it's, if I may use an Irish word, a little fluhulic to dismiss the view of the President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists as just another psychiatrist. When the Royal College of Psychiatrists says that these powers are necessary and are needed in these circumstances, it would behove every member of this chamber to listen to that individual. So I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand. There will be a discussion, there will be consideration of renewal, and at that stage, when we bring recommendations, I'm sure we will hear again from Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Fulton McGregor to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's been a lot of commentary recently about the development of a vaccine. Is there anything in these acts that can help to ensure widespread coverage in Scotland should a vaccine become available?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member raises an interesting question. There is a provision in, I think, the second of the acts, no, the first of the acts, which allows a wider group of people to administer vaccines than is presently the case legally. That has not been used as yet, but there are circumstances in which it could be used, and it is an interesting example of legislation that has been passed which has not yet been required but may be required, and it could be required in two sets of circumstances. It could be required when there is a need for and a request for mass vaccination in terms of a vaccine for the coronavirus, but it might also be needed in terms of the very intensive programme that will take place for the flu virus this year, which I think everybody over 55 is to be offered the opportunity to have the flu virus. So there is a provision within the legislation which I think it would be wise to hold on to, although it has not yet been used. And there will be a number of those provisions in the legislation which we should be aware of and which we should discuss.
Rona Mackay to be followed by... Rona Mackay to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's very welcome that the Scottish Government is taking such a proactive approach to domestic abuse during the coronavirus outbreak. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that guidance for local authorities on how to respond to domestic abuse will continue to be regularly refreshed to reflect any changing circumstances in terms of the lockdown measures which are in place?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can confirm that the provisions that were put into the bill on this matter are not provisions I would expect we would wish to dispense with at this time, so they will continue. The initial analysis of the figures that we have does indicate a rise in domestic abuse during the reporting period, but I think we do need to drill into those figures a lot more closely before we can talk about them in detail. But it was a very important part of this Act, and certainly there is no intention from the Government of walking away from that part of the Act, so I would expect it to continue.
Oliver Mundell to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the constituency member for Gretna Green, can the Cabinet Secretary set out for me why the draconian one-size-all restrictions on wedding gatherings remain proportionate and necessary? How can it be fair to leave individuals and businesses in limbo and delay such an important life event when similar-sized gatherings are allowed in pubs, restaurants and in public transport and all involve strangers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we all receive representations from a range of businesses, and we feel very deeply about them. I've received representations myself in the last few days about wedding venues. But I think we have to look at this in two ways. The first way to look at this is to say that quite clearly weddings can take place, and there's been a big increase in the number of weddings that have taken place as a result of weddings being possible again. But the regulations about weddings are not the same as regulations about social gatherings. And a social gathering is a wedding reception is a social gathering. And in those circumstances, a social gathering of people from many households which are likely to come together. And in those circumstances, it needs to be regulated in the same way as other social gatherings. Now, that is a necessity. I wish it wasn't so, but we need to look at the entire balance of how these things are managed. It is not as simple as taking one item and saying, let's compare that to another item. The priority today should be and is getting schools back. That was the declared priority from the First Minister, and that is something that is now taking place. Nobody wants any regulation or restriction to last a moment longer, but simply shaking your head, Mr. Mundell, does not make something true. The dangers from unlimited gatherings continue to be there, and difficult decisions have to be made as a result of it.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that debt is increasing because people are losing their jobs as a result of coronavirus. I hope, therefore, that the provisions in the first two emergency bills on bankruptcy and debt will be extended as they are needed now more than ever. I would also, however, ask him to consider doing something that the Scottish Government has so far refused to do, which is to freeze interest rates and fees. I sincerely hope that the Scottish Government will not continue to set its face against a progressive measure that would make a real difference to debtors in Scotland. On that basis, will the Cabinet Secretary work with me to help those who end up in debt because they have lost their jobs?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm quite sure that the Minister who deals with these matters, which I think is Jamie Hepburn, will be happy to continue his discussions with you, which have been intensive, I know, and I'm sure that is benefiting both of you, to try and find some way to resolve the issue. But I do want to pay tribute to the work you did on the second act, I think it was, in making sure that we did move on that matter, because it has had an impact. There have been quite a number of people who have paid nothing at all, and some people who have been able to have their charges reduced as a result of that amendment. And that was a result of productive discussion across the chamber. I'm quite certain that you will want to have a discussion with Jamie Hepburn. It will not be possible, as I say, to change this, because the acts will be renewed, items are either renewed or taken out of the Act, but the potential for other action, I'm sure, is still there.
Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Adam Tompkins.
Presiding Officer, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to say some more about what engagement the Scottish Government will have with external bodies, perhaps particularly equalities and human rights bodies, to inform decisions around which provisions in the coronavirus bills will be renewed and which will expire?
Cabinet Secretary.
The timescale for the renewal is clearly tight, but as I indicated in my statement, we want to make sure that we bring forward proposals as close to that timescale as possible, so that we can be as active as possible in terms of making changes. But within that, I would want to see both the government and the committees of this Parliament engaging with others to see what their view is on these matters. And certainly people who feel that they should now be able to open premises which are not open should be part of that process. Human rights bodies should be part of that process. There should be as much as possible in terms of consultation, because people are being asked to observe these regulations, and therefore we want them to be engaged in the setting of these regulations or their renewal.
Adam Tompkins, before by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary said in his statement that powers have been used proportionately. So in the light of that, can I ask, how is it proportionate that gyms are not to open in Scotland until the middle of September, some 2 months after they opened south of the border, when no COVID clusters have been traced to transmission in a gym? How is that a proportionate use of power?
Let me make it clear that the First Minister, in reporting, as she does regularly to this chamber, addresses those questions. And I seem to remember on the last occasion she addressed it, she made it clear that if evidence was brought forward, and we were always looking for evidence that allowed an earlier opening and an earlier safe opening, it would be considered. The view presently is that that is not the situation and will not, but that, once again, it is certainly possible to shout, but it is probably more sensible to listen to the evidence that is brought forward, to the information that is brought forward, and to ensure that we are all taking part in a process which is designed to suppress the pandemic and to move on. And if all that people can do, members can do, is shout, then they're not listening to evidence and they're not thinking of all the fellow citizens who are involved.
John Mason, to be followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, quarantine after foreign travel has been quite a contentious issue. Can you make any comment about these restrictions continuing and the question of which countries are included or excluded?
Cabinet Secretary.
This is obviously considered very closely on a four-countries basis. The evidence comes and is considered, and the evidence comes from two sources. But in these circumstances, we would always, in the end, we would always in the end make sure that we make the judgment based upon what we regard as the risk and the safety to citizens. And that is not an easy thing to do, and we've seen that in other cases in terms of considering, for example, excluding one country which was not excluded elsewhere. But quarantine is essential because bringing the virus into the country is clearly a major issue. And we've seen today in New Zealand, where I think for the first time in 102 days, there are now 4 cases in the city of Auckland. And the action taken in the city of Auckland has been to ensure that there is no possibility of that virus coming in from elsewhere. So we also learn from other people. And we should learn from other people too in terms of considering the totality of the matter and not just one sector against another.
John Mason to be followed, sorry, Monica Lennon to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I accept what the Cabinet Secretary has said today about being proportionate and evidence-based in his approach to the legislation and, of course, the guidelines. Can I raise the issue of funerals? Other colleagues have raised it recently at the COVID-19 committee. Can he explain or publish the evidence base which limits attendance at funerals in place of worship to only 20 people? Many of us can gather in pubs and restaurants across multiple households, but not to mourn our loved ones. Can he spell out the evidence behind this, please?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I've said at committee before, and Monica Nelson knows this, I've said at committee before that if individual members wish to have individual evidence, they should ask ask that, and they will get individual evidence. But there is the overall balance of risk and the judgment reached after a great deal of consideration as to what the balance should be. It is not simply saying there's one sector, there's another sector, let's look at the two of them. It is trying to make sure that there is a balance struck and that safety is preserved by making sure, for example, that the R number is kept as low as possible. It would behove us all if we looked at that as carefully and as calmly as we can and made sure we understood that simply by promoting one sector over another, you may be having unexpected consequences which could be immensely serious. And let's try and do that in the way that we started to do it when this process started, because that was a way that led to success. We should continue with that success.
Joan McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Paragraph 7.1.3.9 of the report concerns aspects of the legislation affecting vulnerable adults and the powers given to local authorities to provide services without involving the views of the vulnerable adult, their guardian, welfare attorney or intervener. Can the Cabinet Secretary reassure us that the purpose of this power is only to keep the individual safe, and given the human rights implication of this restriction on people with a protected characteristic, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if stakeholders will be engaged with in order to understand the impact of these provisions going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Those particular provisions, like the provisions that Alec Cole-Hamilton mentioned, are kept under constant review, and it is very important that we listen to the practitioners and those who are involved in these issues themselves as we come to judgments on them. I can confirm to the member that we will consider very carefully whether these items need to be renewed. We will also consider carefully to ensure that people who are involved in this issue, whether they are service users or whether they are practitioners, are involved in the discussion of what should happen next.
Thank you very much. That concludes this parliamentary statement. We're just in a short pause while we change seats and move on to the next item of business.